let's get to it.
Okay, this is one of the final steps to the small box project that we're doing. This is Dawson's box. It's beautiful. He's got some dovetails going on here. It's time for him to install his hinges. So we're going to be using these nice little brass butt hinges from Lee Valley. So a butt hinge just means that it's a hinge that's going to sit inside the box like so, and all you see is a nice little line, a nice little the hinge pin sitting on the outside there, which is kind of a nice little touch, opposed to a strap hinge which sits kind of on the face on the outside, right? So there are hinges that are designed for that. They're kind of decorative, but we're all going to be using these butt hinges. So in order for this to happen without having a gigantic gap here, we need to make what's called a hinge mortise. So a mortise is a hole. It's a square hole in this case. And we need to make a perfect little hinge mortise for these hinges to sit in. Now the hard part about this is making them exactly the same on the bottom and exactly the same on the top, so that they actually fit precisely and so that the lid alignment still stays precise too. So I'm going to show you guys a trick that is super cool, and this is going to make your life a whole lot easier. So you're going to decide first of all which is the back and which is the front of your box. Me and Dawson have already had this conversation and we've decided this is going to be his back. So I want to flip the lid this way so that my orientation, I know which way it is. And then we need to decide where the hinge is going to go. So we want the hinge to be, equal distant from the ends, and probably something like that. So we're going to take a marking gauge. We're not even going to measure this, because you know what, we actually, like, as much as measuring is a good thing and it's a skill that you guys need to get good at, we can actually be much more accurate without measuring, believe it or not, in this case. So we're going to take a marking gauge, and I'm just going to put that right up to where I want the hinge to start. And notice the depth of about how far the hinge comes into the box. It's about halfway. I don't want to put a mark all the way across there, because that's going to show when we go to stain it. So I'm just going to kind of be mindful of about where that hinge is going to come to. So I have my marking gauge set there. And Dawson, if you can zoom in on this here, I just want to show you guys how this is going to work. So you're going to put a mark. So with your marking gauge, you can actually score the wood fibers starting from about halfway. Now you're going to do the same thing on the drawer bottom. Sorry, on the top. Okay, put those two marks in there. So now we've got, excuse me, we've got our hinges starting exactly the same place on the lid as they do on the top. Okay, we're going to put our hinge back on there, and we're going to readjust our marking gauge for the outside of the hinge, just like that. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing. Put my marks there. And on the lid as well. Okay, now I can take my hinge and I can readjust my marking gauge once again for the depth of the hinge. Now on your hinge you have two leaves. Okay, so just like the leaf on a tree, that's what we call each side of the hinge. It's a leaf. And I'm going to set my marking gauge to the depth of the leaf. Okay, so right where that part of the hinge stops, just before where the hinge pin goes. So I'm going to set my marking gauge to that. Then I can come in from the back face . Same thing on the lid. Okay, so now I don't know if you can zoom in on the camera and see that, Dawson, but we have marks on the box bottom and on the lid that exactly represent the size of our hinge, and they're laid out exactly the same on our lid. Okay. I can also actually put a line, put a mark on the bottom as well. So if I fold the hinge and go halfway to the hinge pin, and so basically half the thickness of the hinge, then I can put a mark, sort of a depth mark. On there as well. Okay, that's going to let me know how deep I want the mortise to be. Alright? So there we go. Now I'm going to stick this in my vise. And I'm just going to do these now one at a time. You can stick this in your vise, or you can clamp it to your workbench. You're going to use a really nice sharp chisel, and trust me, take the extra 10 minutes or whatever it's going to take to sharpen up a chisel that you're going to use for the rest of that class. It is so worth it, especially if you have a really hard wood. We're going to start by defining the boundaries. That's what we call it. We're going to define the boundaries of where this hinge is. So I'm going to take my chisel, and I'm going to put it just ahead of where my line is. So I actually have like a pencil width from where my boundary line is. I'm just going to give that a little tap with a hammer. The reason I don't set it right into the line is because the shape of the chisel, as I drive this thing down, causes the chisel to go down on an angle, right? And if I start in the line, now all of a sudden I'm making a mortise that's too big. So I can always trim up the boundaries later on. But for now, just that's all we need. Okay, and we can go along the back as well. When we go along the back, you don't need a lot because you're going kind of with the grain. Okay? So that's it there. I've got my boundaries defined. Now I'm going to take my chisel, and just a quick review for chisel rules too. Nothing ever in front of the chisel. That doesn't mean I can't hold on to the chisel in this way, but no, none of my body parts are in front of the chisel blade ever, and my part is always secured somehow, whether it be in a vise or clamped to the workbench, okay? And I'm going to use my hand as a bit of a guide, and I'm going to cut a little comb in here. I'm just going to work back, going about the same, as close as I can to the same amount every time, and I'm trying to go down just above where I put that depth mark from the marking gauge. Okay, so just like that, and if you can see, I've gone down, yeah, just pretty much to where about that depth mark is. Now, I'm kind of working a bit backwards so you guys can see how this works, but you would have this thing flipped around the other way in your bench, but you're going to come in here and take your chisel just like this, and just very carefully, without going too far, so really watch your, the amount of power you put in on this, and just bring your chisel in, right, and take that all out, and then these pieces just fall out. Work down little bits at a time. You can come back in, redefine your boundary. In this case, you always want to work across the grain. We have much more control that way, as opposed to going this way. It's going to peel the grain up and make a huge mess. That's why we define the depth by making that comb and come in across the grain and work this way. Okay, it works much, much better. Then we can take our hinge, come in here and do a test fit, and this is perfect. I'm actually just a touch tight. My hinge doesn't quite fit in there, so that's fine. I'm going to just touch up my boundaries, just to give them just a touch more. Try to keep it equal on each side. And the hinge fits nice and tight so that it even stays in there without me having to hold it. Okay, and that's it. Then you can take a a screw or a small center punch, and you can give yourself accurate marks for where you're going to pre-drill and put the 2 screws in that hold that hinge in place. Okay, you're going to do the same thing on all 4, and if you've done it accurately and carefully enough, they should all line up and be perfect. And any little amount that your lid is off from your box when it goes on, we can take the palm sanders and kind of blend that in, blend the 2 together after the hinges are put on. Okay, so that is creating hinge mortise.